Shalom, Mosiah, and Christ blessed. I'm also Aaron from Israel United in Christ, and today we have a very important message. Today's message is going to be dealing with the transatlantic slave trade from the Bight of Biafar as well as the Bight of Benin. So you may say, we all know about slavery already. Why is that so important? The reason it's so important is because the so-called Africans that call themselves Africans on the west coast of Africa, they migrated from Jerusalem. They migrated deeper into Africa where they were shipped off to various different areas. Now you know that's according to the Bible in Deuteronomy chapter 28. So we're going to go to various articles and different sources to help fill in those gaps for you so you can understand your true history. Now the first article we're going to take a look at says slavery and slave trade in West Africa. And it reads, merchants from Brazil arrived in the Gold Coast in the Bight of Benin, so that by the 1720s a substantial export of slaves from the Bight of Benin to Brazil had opened up, continuing to 1850. So the article is telling us that certain merchants came from Brazil to the Gold Coast, as well as the Bight of Benin. Now you may ask yourself, who are these merchants? Portuguese explorers first landed in northeast Brazil in the 1500s. Since Brazil did not appear to have supplies of gold or silver, the Portuguese imported the technology of sugar production to Bight from the Atlantic islands, where the crop had proved successful. Planters in Bight first enslaved indigenous people to work the sugar plantation, but steadily shifted their labor force to one composed primarily of Africans. Brazil continued to import Africans both legally and illegally well into the 19th century before officially ending slavery in 1888. During this long span, Brazil received captive Africans from every part of the continent, landing almost 5 million people in total. Bight alone imported in excess of 1,300,000 men, women, and children, while the areas of Africa importation shifted over time. More than 90% of the Africans who arrived in Bight came from either the Bight of Benin or Central Africa. Now remember, who we were talking about were the merchants that came to the Bight of Benin and the Gold Coast. Now here this article lets you know in the 1500s that the Portuguese explorers were in Brazil. Now pay attention, it says, since Brazil did not appear to have supplies of gold and silver, the Portuguese imported technology of sugar production. So because they didn't have gold and silver, they dealt with sugar production in Brazil. And eventually they moved on to labor of the Africans, which had gold. So what the Portuguese did was they took many of the Africans from the Bight of Benin, from the Gold Coast, and they took them back to Brazil to be slaves there as well. Now the Portuguese came to the Bight of Benin from Brazil to get a hold of gold and of silver because they didn't have it in Brazil. But they took these captives and brought them back to Brazil. Now the numbers it gave are astounding numbers. It says they imported in excess of 1,300,000 men, women, and children. So 90% of the Africans that went over there came from the Bight of Benin and from the Gold Coast, as well as Central Africa. So now that we found out who the merchants were, we're going to go back to the article. And it reads, merchants from Brazil arrived in the Gold Coast in the Bight of Benin, so that by the 1720s, a substantial export of slaves from the Bight of Benin to Brazil had opened up, continuing to 1850. By the early 18th century, the English were able to establish primacy over the Dutch in many areas of commerce. The English colonies in the West Indies expanded their sugar output. So this is the same thing that we read before. Many of them expanded their sugar outputs. They did other things to get different exports. And English merchants in India gained access to the cottons that were so important for the purchase of slaves. Despite all their wars against each other, the Dutch and English also cooperated widely in Europe in organizing African voyages. So this article is showing us that all these Caucasian nations, they came together in one mind. Even though they warred against each other because of the commerce and the trade, they still understood that we need to go ahead and make these people a commodity. We need to make these people slaves. You have to ask yourself, why is that? It said 1,300,000 was just sent to Brazil. This is only covering the Bight of Benin. This is only covering the Bight of Biafar. So you have to ask yourself, why are these things happening to the people of the west coast of Africa? So we're going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 28 to find out why is it that the people of the west coast of Africa, specifically the Bight of Benin, people in the Gold Coast, were targets by all these Caucasian races to take them en masse to Brazil, to take them to the Caribbean islands and all these different places that were mentioned. Why were they the targets? Let's go to the Bible, we're going to find out. It's Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 15. So in Deuteronomy, Moses is talking to the Israelites. And he's telling them, if you don't keep God's commandments, you are going to be cursed. And we're going to read some of the curses that helps explain what's going on here in this article. So Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 15. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. So Moses said, if you don't keep God's commandments, you're going to be cursed as a people. They're going to overtake you wherever you go. Let's go to verse 68. Verse 68. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. So Moses explaining to the Israelites that if they don't keep his commandments, one of the curses would be that they'd be picked up on cargo slave ships and made slaves to work the cotton fields, to work the sugar fields, to work the gold mines, the silver mines, to gather product for another nation. It says you become slave men and slave women. It said no man shall buy you, and you will not see your land again. Because many of us went from the west coast of Africa to Brazil. Many of us never came back to Africa. Many of us came to Louisiana, which we're going to cover later, and never came back to Africa. So now let's go back to the article. Despite all their wars against each other, the Dutch and the English also cooperated widely in Europe in organizing African voyages. So these voyages were pre-planned, they were premeditated. So now you have to ask yourself, okay, well, what put it on their mind to say, oh, let's go to Africa and enslave these people? Now we know that they wanted resources, but was that the only reason that they wanted to come and enslave these people? So we're going to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 28, all right? Now I want to point in verse 68, it says, and the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt. The key point is that the Lord was the one that brought us onto those ships. The Lord's the reason why we ended up on those ships for disobedience. But let's go to verse 49. The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth. So the key point is the eagle. The eagle would be the identifying symbol of the nation that would come and enslave the people on the west coast of Africa. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish. These would all have the symbol of the eagle. So the Bible, God is giving you identifying signs of the captors and the captives. He's not going to leave anybody confused. Even though today we're confused on what happened, why we're in our situation, God left us signs so we would never be confused. So let's go back to the article. Despite all their wars against each other, the Dutch and English also cooperated widely in Europe in organizing African voyages. English success in acquiring slaves won for them the Jacinto in 1713, after which the English delivered slaves to the Spanish for the rest of the 18th century. So to give you a little history on why they call it the Gold Coast, we're going to take a look at this article here. And it states, Gold Coast is a former British colony in West Africa, known today as the Republic of Ghana. In the transatlantic slave trade era, Europeans identified the region as the Gold Coast because of the large supplies of and market for gold that existed there. So we already read that the Portuguese came from Brazil to the Bight of Benin, to the West Coast, to the Gold Coast, because of the gold supplies that was there. It says Portuguese traders built the fort of El Mina in 1482, within 10 years of their arrival on the coast. So this further shows that the Portuguese were the merchants that arrived on the Bight of Benin. Many other Europeans followed the forts and markets of their own, including Danish, Dutch, Swedes, and English. Eventually, the British rose to dominance and established the Gold Coast colony in the mid-19th century. So what happened was that eventually all these other European nations came over and started dealing with the merchandise of West Africa. Eventually, the British took over. European commerce in the region began with a focus on gold, which explorers found to be abundant there, as was the case in many other African regions. Europeans soon began to demand African captives in the trade to the coast. As the kingdoms of the region, especially the Ashanti, began to expand and consolidate their power, a significant part of the regional commerce turned to supplying slaves instead of gold. So what is the Gold Coast? Right here, this is the Gold Coast. With the sharp increase in slave prices in the early 18th century, region after region expanded its slave exports. In chronological order, the Niger Valley, the Bight of Biafra, and Upper Guinea. In the Niger Valley, a band of marauding warriors under the leadership of Mamari Coulibaly developed by 1712 into the leaders of the Bambara Kingdom of Ségou, and their captives went into Senegal as well as across the desert. The Wolof and Bambara slaves from Senegal became important in settling the new French colony of Louisiana. So now we're going to take a look at the Bight of Biafra and the Bambara people. Now this article states, during the era of the transatlantic slave trade, 1519 to 1867, West Central Africa was the leading departure region for captives, accounting for nearly 5.7 million slave embarkations. In second place came the Bight of Benin, which dispatched 2 million Africans, 17%. So it shows you 17% of the slaves that came over were from the Bight of Benin. The Bight of Biafra assumed third place with 1.6 million slave embarkations, 13%. The contribution of the Bight of Biafra to the Guinea traffic was achieved despite the area having mixed potential for slave trading. On the one hand, the Bight of Biafra was the most densely populated region, along with the West African coast in the 18th and 19th century. So what this article is showing us is that millions of Africans, or so-called Africans, came from the Bight of Biafra as well as the Bight of Benin. The Bight of Biafra had a higher mean loss for the slaves exported than any other West African region, though as with those regions, there was a significant decline in slave mortality on the middle passage between 1650 and 1850. Now this is the Bight of Biafra. The Bight of Biafra is a region identified by Europeans and subsequent historians to describe the part of the western African coast between the Niger River and Cape Lopez. This region encompasses the coasts of several modern African nations, including eastern Nigeria, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, and northern Gabon. Major trading cities in the Bight of Biafra included Bani and Old Calabar. From this region, slave traders embarked more than 1 million captive Africans over the course of the transatlantic slave trade. Contemporaries realized the propensity to loss of life on voyages from the main Biafran ports, Bani, Old Calabar, and New Calabar. In the late 17th century, for example, it was noted that whosoever carried slaves from the New Calabar River to the West Indies had need to pray for a quick passage, that they may arrive there alive and in health. So the scholars understood what took place to our people, but for some reason, we forget what happens. We forget our history. This happened from the 1650s to the 1850s, meaning it was not that long ago. So we should not forget our history. We should be able to imagine and be infuriated when we hear about our people going through these atrocities. But we got to go back to the Bible to understand why it actually happened. So we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy chapter 28 in verse 49. The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from one end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth. A nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. A nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. So what God is showing us is that he sent a nation against us because we broke his commandments. Because of our disobedience, God sent another nation against us, packed us on ships, and they said in the article, pray that if they can make it from one place to the other, that they have good health. Because they understood the conditions that was on those boats. They understood that many of us could die. Many of us starved. Many of us had infections. Many of us were killed on them boats. Many of us jumped off the boats because we didn't want to die. We didn't want to be killed by our oppressors. So these European nations, the Dutch, the British, France, Spain, they show no mercy to your people in those times. Even to this day, they show no mercy. But the reason it happened is because you broke his commandments. You went away from the covenant. Now we're going to go back to the article. Britain dominated the slave trade from the Bight of Biafra, which was by a considerable margin the most important West African region for slave departures on British ships between 1525 and 1859. Britain accounted for more than 2/3 of the slave trade from the Bight of Biafra. The dominance of British trading in the Bight of Biafra made the area less cosmopolitan before 1807 and attracting different Europeans than the other parts of coastal West Africa, such as Bight of Benin, the Gold Coast, or West Central Africa. The Bight of Biafra was an important trading region for British slave merchants because they did not establish such an ascendancy consistently elsewhere in Atlantic Africa. So it shows you that many other European nations took part in the slavery of the people in the Bight of Biafra, the Bight of Benin, the Gold Coast. The third phase considers the slave trade from the Bight of Biafra between 1810 and the trade's demise in 1850s. During this period, Spanish, Portuguese, and French traders increased their slave trade at the Bight of Biafra, and British naval and diplomatic activity impinged significantly on the shipment of enslaved Africans from this region. So when they began to start putting laws in place on the enslavement of people in the Bight of Biafra, that's when they started to increase the amount of slave trade that they did. So we just touched on a little bit of information concerning the slave trade from the Bight of Biafra. Now we're going to touch on the people of Bambara. So now we're going to revisit this article. In the Niger Valley, a band of marauding warriors under the leadership of Mamurai Coulibaly developed by 1712 into the leaders of the Bambara Kingdom of Segu, and their captives went to Senegal as well as crossed the desert. The Wolof and Bambara slaves from Senegal became important in settling the new French colony of Louisiana. So now we're going to touch on the Bambara slaves going to Louisiana. So let's look at this next article concerning Louisiana. The first slave ships from Africa arrived in Louisiana in 1719, only a year after the founding of New Orleans. 23 ships brought slaves to Louisiana in the French period alone, almost all embarking prior to 1730. The need for labor on the large concessions proved so great that officials found themselves unable to satisfy the colonists' demand for slaves. Thus, the large number of slaves brought over to supply colonists with free labor soon resulted in enslaved Africans outnumbering free whites. In 1741, 4 African slaves lived in the colony for every 1.2 free white. So one thing you have to ask yourself is, when you read the article, you see that the African slaves, they outnumbered the whites. So if they outnumbered the whites, how is it that we as a powerful people were unable to overthrow these people? Let's go to the Bible and find out. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 32. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand. So God is showing us that our sons and our daughters will be given unto another people. Many of our people did not all go to Louisiana at the same time. Some of us got taken on another boat ride. So we had to watch our mothers, our daughters, our children be taken from us. And the Bible says there should be no might in your hand. You had no power to get them back. You had no power to stop them. And back to the point is, we're in Louisiana with them and we outnumber them. God said there would be no might in your hand. You had no power. Mentally, you felt destroyed. You felt inferior and unable to protect yourself and your family. So now we're going to go back to the article. And it reads, this imbalanced population combined with high mortality, the threat of conflict with the Native Americans, shortages of food and goods, and isolation produced a colony in which African, French, and Spanish cultures blended to create a unique culture known as Creole. Now, a lot of the Haitians. A lot of our people take pride in Creole food, all these things. But this all came at the expense of you being a slave. It all came at the expense of you being a slave. We should take no pride in these things. Let's continue. Because most of the Africans who first arrived in Louisiana were one nation, the Bambara. They succeeded in preserving their language and culture, and through their solidarity, ultimately acted as an Africanizing influence on Louisiana. So our job is to restore the estate, the confidence, and the nationality to our people. So we must always go back to the Bible to see how God feels about us, what God's purpose is for us. So let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 6. It says, "For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God has chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth." So now our conditions, the condition of our people in West Africa, may not reflect somebody that's above all people. But God is true. God tells you that you're above all people, that you're chosen above all people, and nobody else. Now, with that being said, how do we get back to the status that we once were at? Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 46. It says, "And if they sin against thee, for there is no man that sinneth not, and thou be angry with them and deliver them to the enemy, so that they carry them away captives unto the land of the enemy far and near." So God carried our people captives through slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, into many different places. Verse 47, "Yet if they shall bethink themselves in the land whither they were carried captives, and repent." So bethink ourselves. We must remember who we are. We are not Africans. We are not blacks. We are not Negroes. We are the Israelites according to the Bible. "And make supplication unto thee in the land of them that carried them captive, saying, We have sinned and have done perversely. We have committed wickedness. And so return unto thee with all their heart and with all their soul, and the land of their enemies, which led them away captive, and pray unto thee toward their land, which thou gavest unto their fathers, the city which thou hast chosen, the house which I have built for thy name. Then hear thou their prayer and their supplication in heaven, thy dwelling place, and maintain their cause." So God is only going to maintain our cause. He's only going to protect us if we come back to his commandments. There'll be no more extortion. There'll be no more mistreatment. There'll be no more slavery. There'll be no more oppression as long as we come back to God's commandments. That's when we'll be saved from our condition. We must repent. So a lot of the information we cover today is just brief history to refresh our people, to remind them of who they are as a people. Let's go to Job chapter 8 and verse 8. Why is it so important for us to understand our history? Why is it so important for us not to forget? Because God commanded us to remember our forefathers. This is Job chapter 8 and verse 8. "For inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and prepare thyself to the search of their fathers." So God is saying that we must always search for our fathers, our history. We must know why our people are going through what they're going through. As a people in West Africa, we become some of the bases of people. We have to ask ourselves, is this the position that we've always been meant to serve in? Is this how we're supposed to be? Is how our lives are supposed to be? Was there a reason why we went into slavery? These are the questions that must be asked. Now, through today's lesson, I hope that you were able to get a little bit of clarity and understanding on who your people are and why you're going through the things you're going through.